So now I'd like to hand over to Kate Gilmartin to present on the Rossendale Community Energy Net Zero Terrace Streets project. Kate.
Great, thanks, Duncan. Can you see my screen okay? Let me just share that. Okay, great. Yeah, hi, I'm Kate Gilmartin. So I'm a volunteer director with Rossendale Valley Energy. This is a project that I seeded in my old job when I was at the Northwest Net Zero Hub. And these are this is one of the pictures of some of the terrace streets that we're looking at. And really, let me just go to the next slide. So the mission is a project that will create a community support network to help communities to move to net zero. The ambition is to bring local people together into a collective, to bring accessible, affordable, low carbon energy and healthy warm homes at no upfront cost to householders, so no one is left behind. So that collective is really key. So rather than ad hoc piecemeal transition to decarbonisation of heat, where people are going to struggle to actually make the decisions they need to make, or life gets in the way. The idea is that collectively, street by street, community by community, substation by substation, people are brought along on the journey. And the objective is to create a replicable, therefore scalable model that can be utilised by local authorities or third parties or community energy groups, etc., to enable a planned, phased approach to decarbonise communities that would otherwise be stranded or left behind. So particularly when we're looking at rural communities or looking at communities that aren't going to be part of a heat zone, for example. We're looking in this project specifically at terrace streets. There's 10 million terrace homes in the UK. I think about 4 million of those are 2 to 3 bed terraced homes. So those are the ones that are going to have a small footprint. And as you can see, the photo taken down the back alley of those streets in Rossendale, they've got really small outside space. So they're onto the street at the front and tiny backyard at the back. So there's a real issue in terms of space constraint for air source heat pump and also noise constraint. They're old, they're energy inefficient. And often when you look at terrace housing, this is smaller terrace housing, you actually overlay mapping of deprivation, and there's a really close match. So there's a really big issue in terms of affordability for these householders as well. It's key to remark here as well that these are mixed tenure streets. So we're looking at a solution that will be appropriate to everybody on that street. We've got to knock on the door and have exactly the same solution for everybody, which is all part of the speed of delivery. So we don't have to say, well, you're going to have a green mortgage, you're going to have a property linked finance package, and it has to be appropriate for private rented as well. They've got EPCC to get to by 2025 when they have a change of tenure, and private rented landlords that we've spoken to are really keen to know more about our solution because it is no upfront cost to them. So looking at these streets, the kind of default choice would be electric boilers. And obviously they're quite cheap to put in, but they're really expensive to run. So when you think about private rented, that would probably be the solution. So that would mean larger bills for residents than current gas, unless there's a deep retrofit that's done alongside that installation of electric boiler. And as we know, deep retrofit is highly disruptive, which again is a massive barrier. It's been successful in social housing, but that's because people can be moved out. And also there's, excuse me, the consideration of electric boilers put significant amounts of load on the grid, which not only means that you'll actually have time-consuming upgrades, it also means that the DNOs don't know when that's going to happen. So you'll get a trigger and it will be kind of, again, a kind of an unplanned, unphased, well, we're going to upgrade the grid and then actually it needs doing again, etc. So this is all part of looking at a local area energy plan, but in real granularity of detail at substation level to say, what does this area look like on the grid when it is totally decarbonised? So, so this is kind of a bit of a mind map that I did some time ago now, but it really is the underlying kind of foundation and principle of the project. So that black box there has 4 things in it. It has no upfront cost. So that has to be something that we go to the community with, because otherwise that's a big barrier. We've got to include retrofit with anything we do. So we're actually creating healthy, warm homes. The ambient shared ground loop is the technical solution that we came to in the Community Renewal Fund, as individual, as I said already, individual heat pumps aren't going to be appropriate. Electric boilers are going to be too expensive to run. There's not going to be a centralized heat network solution because there's not enough heat load within the area, and we're very far from an industrial cluster, so hydrogen is never going to be the solution here anyway. But don't get me started on domestic heating and hydrogen. But that's for the policymakers. And also power. We've got to look at how we can create local energy markets and get affordable electricity in terms of the tariff price, because obviously we know at the moment electricity prices are much higher than gas, and actually if people electrify their heat, they're going to be paying more. So we've got to have local generation within the mix, and we have to have that in some kind of local energy market stroke energy club to get us to that point where we've got affordable energy. And if we can't get affordable low carbon energy, then we have to rip up the paper and start again, because we've not got a solution. Because the objective is we have to reduce energy costs, and we have to be taking people out of fuel poverty. So the solution in this Terrace Street, I've already said it's about a collective solution, so people aren't left behind. So we're doing the heavy lifting, and you get this kind of social contagion, and you get a mass movement as people, the early adopters, then move into the next kind of a demographic of people as well. So it's really important that it's collective. It's key that we're working with local stakeholders. As I've already said, the DNOs are really important in this, and I'll talk about that in a little bit later. Obviously, the community energy group is key. We're developing this project and partnering with Rossendale Borough Council. It's the 5th smallest local authority in the country. We've already lost 2 people, so there's always a churn. They don't have the expertise, they don't have the resource, but they love working with us because we're bringing them funding and we're also bringing them solutions. So we've got a really great relationship with them. Obviously, energy suppliers, it's all about mobilising the supply chain and obviously bringing finance in. We're looking at shared ambient loop clusters, which we think is going to lower the bills because of it's more efficient in terms of kilowatts electricity in and heat out. It's going to be better on the grid. It's not only going to be planned, it also means it's less impactful. So we're working with ENW, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. So essentially, each house will still have its own heat pump, will replace the existing gas boiler, but it means it doesn't have to go outside. So it's in-home solution. And I think the key point here is how it's all financed. Because we're putting in infrastructure, that means you can leverage debt. And actually, the infrastructure is a really dumb infrastructure. It doesn't have any moving parts except for the heat pump within the home. So it's essentially glycol going down boreholes 150 meters deep, comes out about 12 to 15 degrees, and then it's upgraded within the in-home heat pump. But it means that the debt is sat on the infrastructure, not the householder or the house. And what we're also going to do is put the standardized retrofit package. That debt will also sit on the infrastructure as well, and people will pay back via standing charge, which is exactly how we pay for the national grid, electricity and gas currently. And another key part of the mechanism is the Fairer Warmth, which is the digital consumer journey, which is designed around a reach, engage and retain methodology, and is really a user app, a platform, and our CRM system. But it will be the backbone of how we create these energy clubs. And in the long term, that will be how we deliver local flexibility for that substation as well. So that's a key part of of how we're delivering the project. So why is it important? We've already said there's millions of terrace homes already. A lot of them aren't going to be in heat zones. As we've said, there's affordability issues, the barrier of noise and space constraint. So it's really useful to look at how we prioritise our heat decarbonisation. And at the moment, we're not prioritising people who need the help the most. We're looking at retrofitters able to pay, able to contribute or whatever. Obviously, social housing is doing great guns. And what we're doing here is taking that model of social housing decarbonisation, where they've done lots of shared ground loops and lots of retrofit. And we're taking that success and transposing that onto these mixed tenure streets to say, how do we deliver this solution to these people on the streets? It's got to be homogenous, so we've got to knock on the door. It's got to be the same for everyone. It's got to be no upfront cost, and it's got to be for mixed tenure, including for private rented. It's key that it's affordable, and obviously if we're doing 500 houses at a time, then that's how we really think about mobilizing the supply chain. Even if we only get 30% of those 500 houses uptaking the solution, which is kind of our critical mass for deployment, it shows the supply chain how we're going to be developing this model, and they can actually start thinking about how they deliver, how they're going to procure, and how they're going to train up the jobs and skills needed to do that deployment. The key is that the model can be adaptable for other communities. Derek obviously talked about chipping. I'm also on the working group at chipping. It's a slightly different model because we're not including the retrofit, or that has to sit separately because of all the different types of archetypes within the chipping. But the underlying principle is the same. It's shared clustered community approach where the cost is shared across the community and repaid via standing charge. And the key is the model that we're developing is all about third parties being able to pick this up. And I'll talk about that in just a minute. So engagement is obviously absolutely key to developing this model. And obviously co-production and it being a community-centric project is also absolutely key. If we can't get people to sign up, then we don't have a model and we don't have a project, and we can all go home and start again. So we've got to try and aim for that 30% of community sign up to get to that deployable solution. And as I said, we're using the Fairer Warmth platform, and that's really going to be doing three things. It's going to be developing clusters of interest and mapping those clusters. And I call that the cold start community approach. So essentially we're looking at the red line area I showed you on the Terrace Street earlier, but how do we spore this into the neighbouring communities? Well, we go first with the app, so kind of carpet bomb with posters and GP, community centres, bus hoardings, flyers, schools programme, etc., and start getting people to download the app. And then that's followed up with community energy champions, kind of the support network being pushed out into new neighbourhoods, and then really trying to develop that new interest. So that's there to try and map that cluster of interest. And then the app is there to retain people's interest. So we've got to reach them. We've then got to engage people, but then we've got to retain their interest as we take them along this journey as well. So that the hook there is trying to save people money on their current energy bill. So the user app is very centered around how people can save money in the short term through energy efficiency measures. And we've got some local energy advice delivery funding to help us do that in Rossendale. And then the third thing that the app needs to do is actually collect data to help us build our energy model street by street. So really, we only need a couple of people on each street to download the app and us to start collecting data on their energy consumption and what type of house fabric it is, etc., supported by energy champions, to start building that model of what the system design will look like as developed. And then, as I said, later on, that kind of app will be the local energy club that people will hopefully use to do things like flexibility. So when there's excess community solar on the system, push notification will go out to people to say, hey, put your dishwashers on, it's some free electricity right now, or low cost electricity, etc. It's just worth noting on that point about flexibility. Obviously, flexibility is a massive market which is yet to have a new model. And I think it's really interesting to see that the Strategic Innovation Fund Beta has just been awarded to a project called CrowdFlex, which is basically an iteration of the Ofgem demand-side response model that happened last winter, where people could switch off and earn money, etc. That has been won by Octopus and OVO and also Amazon Web Services, which I think is really, really telling, because obviously these are really, really big players who want to hoover up consumer aggregation, and it's dispersed consumer aggregation. But really the value in a few years' time will be localized flexibility and that localized aggregation, because that's where flexibility will need to be. But I presume they're looking for massive market reach, and then they'll do the localized at a later date. I'm slightly worried that they are getting the early mover advantage, and you can understand that actually the flexibility benefits will be sucked out, whereas the model we're creating is a non-profit extractive model where any benefits, whether that's through economies of scale or through flexibility, go back into the community to go back into getting more and more affordable energy for that householder. So a key part of our model is about that non-profit extraction and kind of welding that into the underlying structure of how this is actually developed and delivered across communities. So the model is obviously based on a smart local energy system. So we've talked about shared ground loop. We're also looking at community EV car clubs, storage, solar PV on roofs itself, but also on buildings that Richard's working on. Thank you, Richard. So this is where it fits in your work, Richard. And also peer-to-peer power purchase agreements. So we're working with Urban Chain on that. And obviously that's kind of going to be optimized. So people will be able to optimize their bills, get flexibility, reduce their costs when they're using electricity, and actually feed in that local community energy as well. And then there's all kind of commercial models. It's all these subsystems and how they fit together. And that is the open source model that we'll hope to create in the funding that we've just put a bid in for. And that model hopefully will be able to be taken up by other local authorities or third parties to actually see how that can be developed in their own community. So obviously key are the stakeholders. As I said, it's about co-production. So our energy champions are going to be really, really key to feedback, what people are saying to us on the ground as they're knocking on doors. We've done some consumer blueprint mapping. So what is that user journey? What is the line of visibility? So really taking into that kind of the Amazon 3-click approach. So people don't need to see more, we could make it as simple as possible for people, but then underneath this line of visibility are all the processes that allow this to happen. And really, we've got a really broad team working on this, and it is kind of a hive mind approach because nobody's thought of everything, and it's really kind of how do we make sure that we've got a fast fail methodology. So as we're looking at we need to seek out the problems because, quite frankly, I've been working on this for a number of years now, and I probably have very rose tinted an optimism bias, etc. So it's about bringing fresh eyes in, and that's what we've done with the tender of the bid we've just put in. We brought fresh eyes in who will be able to critically evaluate the project and look at what we've missed and where we've missed things. How do we actually resolve those issues? So where the project has come from. So we looked at the technical solution originally through the Community Renewal Fund, and we've been working with Borough Huppold on that from the get-go. And Community Energy South also worked with us to help set up Rossendale Valley Energy. We also looked at retrofit. We did energy audits on the terrace houses. We looked at doing training on retrofit, and tellingly, we had really low uptake for the training on retrofit because there isn't a supply chain and there aren't the jobs to go to. So the project is all about creating this new demand. And then when we've created the new demand, the supply chain will mobilize to deploy the solution for that new demand. We've looked at technical solution, the financial solution, and that was part of the Pathfinder Place Stage 1. And also the Strategic Innovation Fund on the grid solution. We've done discovery, and the next stage will be the Alpha, and that's with Electricity Northwest, Northern Power Grid, and UK Power Network. So kind of really broad reach on that, and great to bring them in to develop that their intel to put their knowledge into this project as well. And we already talked about the engagement, which is the Fair and Warmth platform and app, but obviously you have to have the analog version and the boots on the ground that will support that platform, and also make sure people who are digitally non-included are included. And then governance as well. So how do we make sure we retain community wealth in a non-extractive model? So if we get the Pathfinder 2, we've got Sonia Bedford working on this, which is great, and another expert who looks at not-for-profit models and how you can set those up. So that's a really key part of the governance. So next steps, we've already done the application for, and we've put in for 2.5 million stage 2 for Pathfinder. Not sure whether we'll get that. There's only 26 projects, I think, going for it. And I think our USP is that we have developed something which is for smaller local authorities, all can tuck underneath. Say, for example, Bristol, they've obviously gone for centralised heat networks that they're rolling out to the peripheries, but they've still got stranded communities that are never going to be appropriate for a centralised system. So how can we slot in with this solution under those bigger local authorities who have developing much bigger frameworks? And also ours is very community centric, so it's kind of grassroots up, where a lot of the other big combined authorities are very top down. Strategic Innovation Fund, and just continue our work looking at this kind of standardized, replicable, scalable model, whole systems approach. That's really, really important that we're doing everything at once, but in an energy sense. You know, the longer game will be also to think about, well, if we're doing works and going into lofts, can we put in, you know, grey water harvesting, etc.? Can we put in suds? Can we put in water butts? How can we green the neighbourhood? What's the traffic plan? So we see this as kind of stage one into greening, kind of creating net zero neighborhoods. Obviously the key 5 things: technical, financial, grid, engagement and governance. Keep working on those. Looking at the economies of scale, how do we mobilize? What is the consumer journey? Continue to engage partners as widely as we can. We've shared the report from stage 1 a lot, but we've also got a lot of interest back as well, including political interest, which is really good, and also continue to work with Rossendale Borough Council, but also other local authorities as well who are expressing interest. So in a nutshell, this is what we put into Pathfinder Place. Stage 2, continue to develop service model. How do we, all those different transactions and interactions with different stakeholders as part of this kind of commercial model with all the subsystems that are linked to it. Continue to develop the digital consumer journey, and we're doing work on that with the local energy advice delivery as well. Looking at the operational and organisational governance, refining the procurement, legal and commercial financial templates, disseminate the outputs, including the toolkit, looking at the planning approach to identify and engage with communities. I think just on that, going back to the kind of cold start community approach, I'd like to think that this model could be seeded by community energy groups, or it could be that we reach out to local authorities to help them pick priority areas and actually, you know, work with them to say, this is how you can plan a phased approach to how you address affordable energy in those priority areas as well. So there's different ways that this can be seeded, but I do hope that community energy groups can also pick this up. We're working with 2 geographies, so we're obviously carrying on in Baker and Rossendale, but we've also brought on board Bridgend, who were not successful with the Heat Pump Ready programme, but have done a lot of work in this area around Terrace streets as well. And also looking to do a 3-house demonstrator and actually work with the supply chain to see how that all fits together and get feedback as we go. The contracts, insurance, warranties, etc., and then disseminate to a wider audience as well. So I think that's me. So I'll just end that, stop sharing, and yeah, take any questions if there's any there.
Sydney.
Hi,
Thanks, Kate.
I've got 2 questions. That's absolutely fantastic. But one about funding and how easy it is to get that capital from investors to start with. And then the other one is heat zones. I'm a bit nervous about heat zones mandating and telling consumers what they've got to have. And how could this maybe work well with the heat zone legislation?
Yeah, thanks, Sydney. So from a funding perspective, we have been talking to UK Infrastructure Bank, Triple Point, Bankers Without Boundaries, and I know Derek's, I think he might be on the call, maybe he's dropped off, but oh no, Derek's there. So in Chipping, they're looking more at a community investment model, whereas in Rossendale, we're looking at an institutional finance model. So we want the pension funds to come in here. I know pension funds, you know, they don't get out of bed for more than 25 million, but actually when you start to scale this type of solution, then you quite quickly get to that kind of number. So the key here is creating that demand and then showing the demand that we've created to then bring in the financiers to say, right, okay. And we think that it's quite a low risk model because of the infrastructure itself is done, and it is long lasting. So that kind of plastic pipe work will last 80, 120 years. So the risk is that there's a newer technology that comes along that's more efficient, etc. But we've had gas boilers for 50 plus years. So I don't think it's going to be a new technology taking over from heat pumps for some time. So the other risk is obviously that people don't pay their standing charge. So those are risks that we will be putting in the risk register. And if we get the Pathfinder 2, a lot of our work will be, we've got abundance investment on our team to look at that, to look at community municipal bonds, but also engaging with those pension funds to say, what are your, what do you want to see us do? UK Infrastructure Bank are really interested in this because they have kind of 3 priorities. One is obviously carbon savings. One is one's return on investment and the kind of risk around that. One's obviously carbon emissions, and the other is social impact. So this project is of interest to them. But what they won't do is they won't come in and push out private finance. They want to enable and leverage in private finance. So in terms of a bigger demonstrator, this funding is called demonstrator funding, but unfortunately it's one of those funds where it's just revenue and you can't put capex in. So we can only do 3 house demonstrator if we get it through putting it down as materials to show as a way of kind of empirical evidence, really. But really we want demonstrator funding to actually do, at least 8 terrace streets in this round 1 substation. So whether we can go on to get Strategic Innovation Fund beta for that. On your second question around heat zoning, so obviously heat zoning, I think Bristol have got heat zoning. That's only piloted at the moment in certain areas. I think Lancaster, I think maybe Liverpool, I'm not quite sure. But generally at the moment it's only around centralised heat networks, and it's not for domestic at all, it's for commercial. So it's whether they at some point enforce that for domestic. Government don't like to tell voters what to do, so I think that they probably would be reticent about that. In this community, we don't think people really have got great choice. They could try putting an air source heat pump in, but it's very likely to get damaged and not work very efficiently in a very small backyard. Really, they've got electric boiler option or a collective community option, which is going to be a lot cheaper for them to run. So that's a big part of how we think we're going to be able to get the buy-in for this solution, because it should be able to reduce people's bills. And actually their other options are very limited. But yeah, so I've got our eye on heat zoning because it could be something useful, but these communities aren't going to be heat zoned anytime soon, because it's basically looking at centralized big city centre.
Good. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Kate. Richard.
Yeah, you mentioned a couple of times storage, and one of the pictures had a PCM, a phase change material heat store. So is that a kind of an integral part of the project that you're going to say, so everyone needs in their house space for this, basically water source heat pump and space for a PCM energy store? And then if you're going to be providing flex services, obviously you need to have some kind of remote control, some fleet control over that. Is that part of the package? Is that part of the plan? And I'm interested in anything you've got observations about how you square the whole kind of need to control for flex versus need to actually give people control and not give them weird and new complicated things they don't understand.
Yeah. No, it is absolutely going to be part of the solution. So it is a smart local energy solution. So it's basically you've got two sets of parameters. You've got your parameters at the substation, which is the requirement for peak shaving or basically load control. But then you've got your comfort parameters. So basically, you'll only get your heating switched off in your house if it's at temperature, and we know that it's going to stay at temperature for 2 hours or whatever. So the comfort parameters are more important in some ways, but actually no, they're both equally important in that smart local energy solution. The way we'd work that with householders themselves is in their bill, they will be able to kind of tick, yes, I want to get the best savings through my bill, including smart energy control systems. So people won't be fiddling around unless they want to, but most people won't want to. Most people say, yeah, just give me the best savings, or no, I want total control, and then they'll have a home energy monitor and they'll be able to fiddle around with it themselves. But the idea is that most people will just say, yeah, give me the best deal, and it will just be tinkering around the edges. So that's how the flexibility work. I mean, obviously it would be either kind of sun amp still quite expensive in terms of thermal store, or it'll be smart water cylinder. But obviously that has space issues. So that's where the app comes in and the champions come in, because we'll be messaging people to say, hey, have you still got a hot water cylinder in your cupboard, or a cupboard where you used to have a hot water cylinder, or is that now a shower? So take a picture, have you got room here, etc. So the idea is that people are able to give us as much information as they can via the app, or if that's not happening, by a knock on the door from the energy champion to build that level of detail.
Thanks.
Brilliant. Anybody else?
I was just going to say one more thing on that kind of Derek popping up to remind me of, because obviously with heat zoning, Derek's working on the Chipping project, which is the rural off-gas grid community. And I mean, I don't know what your thoughts are on heat zoning for those rural communities, because they're definitely looking at being stranded, Derek. I don't know whether you've got anything to say on that.
I think, Kate, that heat zoning in rural communities is going to be a long way down the line, really, and we're really following the Broadband for Rural North model, which is trying to find a solution for the hard to reach communities, and we're doing that. And Barn and Broadband for Rural North had to do that because these communities were being left behind by the large commercial companies as they delivered solutions to the sort of the urban areas. And I suspect heat zoning will be the same for rural communities. But the other key element in terms of the approach we're trying to do is to make sure that even if you're not in a village or a settlement, you don't get left behind. So it's trying to give that flexibility of ensuring that there's a solution for everyone within the community, regardless of whether you're in the village or not.
Thanks, Derek. Kate, I have a quick question. I remember you talking about Lime and the possibility of 600 Mixergy cylinders delivering 2.5 megawatts of flexibility. So among 500 houses, maybe with a 30% take up, how much flexibility and how much cost saving to the householders do you think using flexibility could deliver?
Yeah, so lim, I was really confused then. You mean lim? It looks like it's pronounced lime though. Yeah, I was like, what? Yeah, I mean, I suppose the value of flexibility will be around where the DNOs need that flexibility. Unfortunately for us in Bacup, ENWL doesn't actually really need any flexibility, but it will come, at some point. The grid is getting more and more constrained. And I think the key is the DNOs don't really know what's on the grid most of the time. There's really minimal visibility of what's there, what's in the substation. So this is a really useful way of actually getting the DNOs to go, okay, what's the end game look like when everyone has decarbonised, and therefore what's transformer upgrades do we need in our substation? What flexibility might we need? There is a figure in the application which shows how many kind of megawatt hours of flexibility, megawatts of flexibility we can deliver across Rossendale. I can't remember what it is off the top of my head, but it's, the flexibility will only have value where it's needed. But we're kind of saying that this project embeds flexibility within its core. So when flexibility is needed, it's already there rather than to have to be paid for at a later date. So it's basically a free resource to the DNOs at a later date, if that makes sense. Yeah,
and would you use excess solar from the roofs to drive heat to the heat store as being the most effective way of sort of sinking that?
Yeah, I mean, quite possibly. I mean, basically the smart solution will send electricity wherever it needs to go, across, it might be going to EV car batteries, it might be going into smart water cylinders, or depending on who needs what when. And I think that's the thing. It's like a massive amount of data, and this goes back to data again, obviously, and that's why Amazon Web Services scares the bejesus out of me, that actually that data has huge value, and flexibility will have huge value. And if we don't offer a competing narrative for this model, then these big boys are going to get market share. So we have to kind of really ensure that we are kind of looking at this kind of collectively substation by substation at community level.